This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
And we are beginning with one of the longest-running real-life mysteries in Houston's history. For the first time on TV, a man confesses to one of the Killing Fields murders.
Investigative reporter Jeremy Rogowski sat down with the guy who says he did it.
His name is Mark Stallings. I sat down with him in prison for about an hour, and in that time, he laid out a raw and uncensored chain of events that led to the murder of a young woman. He's clear and convincing.
I can walk out there right now where she was.
About what happened 25 years ago.
You knew from the moment you picked her up.
Exactly. When I picked her up, I knew exactly what I was doing.
Mark Stallings had picked up the young woman on Telephone Road. They went to a motel, Stallings says, and did some drugs.
And then, I told her, I said, look, let's go for a ride.
That ride took them south to League City and a field off I-45 and Calder Road, where Stallings once worked as a ranch hand and where 3 bodies had already been discovered in the 1980s. The young woman with Stallings would be the 4th in the Texas killing field.
I ended up getting the seatbelt that hit her in the head with the seatbelt buckle, right? And then I wrapped the seatbelt around her neck and choked her out.
You say choked her out, meaning?
Yeah, I choked her out, no.
You kill her?
Yeah, no.
The body was found months later in 1991. Decomposed, authorities have never been able to identify the woman, known only by this artist rendering as Janet Doe. It wasn't the first time Stallings admitted to killing Janet Doe.
February 2014.
Jim Carroll is an ex-con himself who exchanged letters with Stallings for more than 2 years.
I know I had no right to take this young girl's life.
For Carroll, the tone of the letters is clear.
I think he's trying to clear his conscience, because he knows he's not going to get out.
Stallings is serving 2 life sentences for unrelated crimes. If he is, in fact, clearing his conscience, he's doing so in great detail.
See where that's exactly where I put her.
Even pointing out the location of Janet Doe's body on a map he drew for Jim Carroll.
Texas has convicted people for less than this.
But to this day, Mark Stallings has not been charged in the murder of Janet Doe.
Indict him.
It's not that simple, say investigators at the League City Police Department.
Just because somebody says they did something doesn't always give us enough ammunition to actually take them to court.
Marty Grant was one of the original detectives on Janet Doe's case and says Stallings confessed back then too, but later recanted. And now Grant says his story's changing again.
Some of the things he told you does not corroborate some of the things he told me all those years ago.
Throwing more questions into the mix.
Do you have any remorse?
Who to believe, what to believe.
I shouldn't have did what I did.
Adding to the mystery of the Texas killing fields. Stallings says he never even knew the name of the woman he killed. His interview gives investigators new hope that he will once again talk about Janet Doe. As for the other 3 women found in the Calder Road field, well, Stallings says he had nothing to do with their deaths, and police tell me they continue to build a case against another suspect in those murders. Jeremy Rogowski, KHOU 11 News.
League City police are still trying to figure out Janet Doe's identity. They are looking for any families that had a person vanish during that time period for possible DNA matches. Now, you can find out more information on KHOU.com.
This case is known as the Calder Road killings or the Killing Fields. There were 4 victims found throughout the years. The fact that the offender chose this area gives us a couple little tidbits of insight. It's such a remote, rural area. Somebody had to know about that place. What we're looking for is some anomalies that exist between all four girls. If there's one person that knew all the girls, or one person that was seen with the girls, that of course would be a great lead for us. But anything that anybody in the public knows, anything, no matter how small they think it is, we really want them to come forward, because it may be very significant to us, even though they think it's just a small tidbit that doesn't have any meaning.
Yeah, I think about Laura every day. I miss her, and it's always going to be that empty plate at the dinner table, but, you know, her death wasn't in vain. It wasn't in vain. I'm not going to say it still isn't difficult. I would go out there where Laura's body was found, and I would walk up to her cross. I put my hand on her cross and I say, Laura, please don't hate your daddy, but I can't come out here anymore. I have to say goodbye, and I have to put my life back together. And I'd literally be walking away, and I hear this little voice say, Dad, don't quit, please don't quit. I'm going to fight to my dying breath to do what I can do to make sure whoever murdered Laura and the other girls, justice is served.
The fact it hasn't been solved doesn't mean it's not being worked, and doesn't mean it's not being worked diligently. It just means that we're not getting the breaks that we need at this point. We need to go further and find the killer and bring him to justice, and I think that would heal a lot of wounds in the community.
I was at work, and one of the girls said, Miss Diane, your phone is going off. And when I went and looked at it, I had 2 calls from my cousin, and then a text that said, call ASAP. And when I called her, she said, where are you? I said, I'm at work. She said, go outside. I said, okay, I'm outside. And she said, Diane, I just got off the phone with the Detective Tisdale from the League City Police Department. And I knew, my knees fell out. Gina started to tell me they found her. I don't want to know. I didn't want to know any of it. I just was relieved. I was relieved. She had a pretty tough life. She loved to shrimp and crab and fish on the banks of the Sabine River. She loved her children so much. The bottom line to all this is no one deserves to die like she did. No one.
It's very important for the public to know that we have not given up. You know, it may be labeled a cold case. That doesn't mean it's just sitting on a shelf not being worked. It's being worked actively at FBI. It's being actively worked at League City Police Department, and we have other resources from other agencies that are helping out. I want everybody to know that nobody has given up on this case. And I want the offender to know, if he's watching, that we will come get you.
Well, it looks like we're headed back to Texas, y'all. Welcome to another episode of True Crime XS. And I'm going to go ahead and apologize right now for the quality of the studio this week. And the next 8 weeks, in fact, I'll be mobile. But we should be back to normal by the time we get to season 2.
So this is an interesting case because it's discovery post-mortem interval. So basically, and there was some debate if you look at the paperwork, it has 2 dates, 1971 and 1978, for the date of last contact for Dr. Walter Springer Lawton out of Pennsylvania. You were able to determine that it's mentioned in a newspaper in 1971, so we think 1971 is the correct date.
Right.
So this guy is a doctor and basically walks off. He's 64 years old. The way that this works is there was quite a bit of searching for this guy. There was a reward, so family was looking for him basically, and
well, he was visiting an area, and it was so he wasn't at home, and he was staying in a cabin with his wife, and while they were in this area, I believe he was recently retired, and he had been going on a walk every day, and he went to go on his walk for the day, and he didn't return. So it sort of goes from there. His wife, first, she sought out some of the locals, if you will, that immediately, helped her. They formed their own sort of search party, people who knew the area, and called in the appropriate resources. And so he was essentially, in a short amount of time, he was being looked for. He had never suffered any sort of health problems up until recently. And I gotta find my window here. So hold on one second. Because I found it very interesting what was said about it. Essentially, his wife says, my husband had not always needed so much personal attention. 2 summers ago, he contracted encephalitis, parentheses, it says sleeping sickness.
Oh, interesting.
And that's what it says, and this is quoted from an article titled Retired Professor Missing 1 Month, The Terrifying, Sad, Fruitless Search, $500 reward offered by wife to anyone providing clue to Dr. Lawton. And this is actually the article. It's actually in a image slot on his NamUs profile, so it doesn't have the citation from what paper it's from.
Walter Springer Lawton was last seen in Whitehaven, Pennsylvania on June 7, 1971. He and his wife were visiting the area of Nescopeck Creek. They were planning to buy a cabin. Lawton went for a walk at 3 o'clock p.m. that day and has never been heard from again. Dogs later tracked his scent to the railroad bridge overpass area on the road to Mountain Top, Pennsylvania, but in spite of an extensive search, he was never located. Lawton previously worked as a professor and chairman of the mathematics department at Temple University before his Parkinson's disease forced him into early retirement. Dr. Lawton was declared legally dead on June 7, 1978, the 7th anniversary of his disappearance. Walter Lawton was 64 years old. He was 5 foot 3 inches tall, weighed around 125 pounds. He has white hair and blue eyes. He wears wire-rimmed eyeglasses. His case remains unsolved.
So she says he contracted encephalitis, which was, according to the article, a sleeping sickness, and then he was found to have Parkinson's disease, and that had forced him to have early retirement. So within a couple of hours after his daily walk that he went on every day while they were in this area, by dinner time, his wife had called in the cavalry, so to speak, because it was unusual that he hadn't returned, and it was worrisome to her. So obviously this says he's been missing a month, so this is on into July of 1971. They looked really hard for him, not in this particular article, but in one of the things that I came across, there was information that someone had brought out the search dogs and that they were able to track his scent up to the dogs followed Mr. Lawton's scent from his cabin to the railroad bridge overpass area of the road to Mountain Top, Pennsylvania, but he was not located. Again, that was June 7th, 1971, and according to NamUs, it's in Whitehaven, Pennsylvania, and further, it's in the Nescopeck Creek area. So that's in 1971. So what kind of happened with this case was, this is one of the very first matches I ever made. And so I feel like a little bit bad because I know it wasn't reported when I first made it. And if it's him, that's terrible of me. But in my defense, I didn't know exactly what I was doing so to speak. It has been reported now, and thanks for doing that. But I made this match. Well, then he was missing in 1971, and so this is a 70s match case, which it goes along with what we started out sort of doing before we got sidetracked with the Bundy stuff with the boy in the box and his potential other victims. And I do not think this man is a victim of Ted Bundy's. He is one of the cases from the 70s that was in the back of my mind. Well, as it turns out, it wasn't just there waiting for me. I had to dig and dig and dig and dig through all of my notes, and I found it. And I was actually getting anxious because I was thinking I wasn't going to find it. And so in my mind, I had a picture of what the man looked like. And I went through the NamUs listings, and I actually thought it was, I wasn't sure of the date. And so I was looking for his picture. And as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, that's him. And so that's interesting to me that I couldn't recall his name or anything else about him, but that picture was just really ingrained in my brain to the point that I was able to locate him based on just the picture.
Unidentified person, number 6513. On January 1st, 1990, in Brunswick County, Virginia, a deer hunter searching for his dog found scattered human remains. One or both hands was not recovered. It was only partial skeletal parts, with short, brown, straight, or curly hair on the cranium. The decedent has numerous healed injuries that are several years old, consistent with a possible past motor vehicle accident or serious fall from a height. His healed injuries include a craniotomy, a skull, head, or brain surgery. There are surgical perforations, and 5 healed burr holes. The skull has a healed defect from surgery on the left side, a healed fracture on the left side of the skull extending to the right parietal bone, and healed fractures of the left side of the frontal bone, the nasal bone, the right maxilla bone, and both zygomatic arches. There are healed fractures to the left clavicle, right and left ribs, and the left ulna. He was wearing a blue and white short-sleeved sports shirt and a single blue sneaker that was a Trax brand. His height could not be estimated, but it was considered to be an adult between 45 and 65, who was male and Caucasian. His estimated postmortem interval was months to possibly a year. His estimated year of death was 1989. This person remains unidentified.
The unidentified person that, you're considering a match and researching if it's a match, and I reported it to the Pennsylvania State Police, that's what stood out, is there was a clay reconstruction of what was essentially the skull, and that is what sort of tipped us off.
Right, and actually, okay, so the particular found body, we'll get into the details in a minute, but it has 1,064 exclusions, and in my perusing of NamUs, that's one of the highest numbers of exclusions I've ever seen.
It's a lot. That's an extreme amount.
I took notice of that. That is a situation where bones were randomly found by a hunter, and it's a January 1st body found. So what that basically means is they're not really sure when it was found. They just lump it in there. It was found this year sometime, or around this time.
It's the dumping ground, for the paperwork.
Right. So this case illustrates what I was talking about when I was saying that the system cross-references human entries and humans make mistakes. No big deal, but it can mean the difference between somebody being identified and somebody not being identified. And sort of what I mean by that. Oh, and so just to clarify, I found both the unidentified person and the missing person based on looking at the faces that were available. So no names, no locations, no anything else except I set the search mode to gallery and I started looking through. Now it took me quite a while because I didn't have any other information. But once I did have one false positive, but he did look quite similar, but it wasn't him. The unidentified person that I located that I feel like is a match for Walter Springer Law says that there's a interval between death and discovery of several months to a year. And the estimated PMI is months, and the estimated year of death is 1989. Sort of what I want to throw out here. Now, I don't know that they're a match. It's been reported, and this man has been cross-referenced and excluded as being 1,064 people. And he's never been compared to Walter Lawton. And the reason is, let's say if the system works how I imagine it works, beyond the exclusions that somebody has done, which are the 1,064. The fact that this says the estimated year of death is 1989 and the estimated post-mortem interval is just months, it would exclude Walter Lawton's case from being compared to this case because, like we said, he went missing in 1971. Now, along with, the January 1st date and this sort of, I don't want to say like willy-nilly, but like they sort of like, okay, let's get this case into the system and without possibly considering like what the difference leaving something blank as opposed to like making your best guess would do as far as the search might go. They had a very good facial reconstruction of what a anthropologist, I assume it's a forensic anthropologist. I don't know who did it, but I assume it's somebody who knows about this stuff. And they reconstructed the man's face out of clay. One of the things that I spend a whole lot of time doing is like taking these bizarre cases. And this one, the reason it caught my attention was because he had been compared to everybody. It wasn't him. But I went face by face by face by face, and I didn't take anything else into consideration. Just the faces, I found what I thought was matched. And the time between when Walter Lawton went missing and when this body is entered as being found is 19 years, 1971 to 1990. The post-mortem interval here is said to be months. Now, not at first, because at first I wouldn't have drawn these conclusions, but now in my mind, they found a few bones. Okay. It actually, I'm pretty sure it says somewhere that it was just partial skeletal parts only. So this is
they were missing some parts. They couldn't estimate certain aspects like the height, etc.
Right. And so from that, there's no way to really know. I mean, this was whoever entered it. It was their best guess, or they put it in because, they couldn't hit enter until it was filled. I don't know. And I think that once you've got sort of skeletal remains, they're bones. You've got bones. It opens up the possibility of longer post-mortem intervals. Now, that can't be really argued for people who aren't there. Like if you find a person who is still in good shape and hasn't begun to decompose yet, that has different circumstances attached to it. And I don't know that, I wouldn't say they're 100% accurate all the time, but it's probably closer and maybe a little easier to identify those types of post-mortem intervals. I have no idea what made this entry go in as months. I do think having it entered as months would preclude it from being considered in a 19-year-old missing persons investigation. The other thing is it's just short of 400 miles between where Dr. Walter Lawton went missing and where these bones are found. The bones, I imagine, the way that the unidentified person report kind of reads, I imagine that they've been scattered by animals. Just nature kind of taking its course. The fact that only part of the skeletal remains were found, it was sort of a mess, basically, is what I kind of gather. However, somebody's trying to find the bone's owner for sure. I went face by face by face, and then I come across this guy 19 years earlier who went missing And there's not a whole lot of information about his disappearance. I would normally, this may not apply to Dr. Lawton particularly, but usually a 64-year-old man who has recently found out he's ill going missing, it to me would seem like a suicide. Just, right off the top of my head. But this case, it seems weird because it does seem like it was odd that he would leave his wife behind like he did, sort of, in this weird situation. And so I started thinking, well, so I found by face a missing person and an unidentified body that look like they are the same person. And the unidentified body is based on somebody reconstructing it. So, that's hit or miss depending on the person's ability to reconstruct it. But he looks like him. And from there, I start sort of looking into this. Well, it is 400 miles between where the bones are found and where the missing person went missing. But in the circumstances of his disappearance, it indicates that his scent was tracked to a railroad bridge overpass. And I started looking, and I realized that if he had been walking along on his walk, and for whatever reason, if he had some other health issue and fell off the overpass and somehow made it onto a train, he could have made that 400 miles. And then at some point he was no longer on the train, and then animals would naturally disperse the bones. And so when you called, what I was looking at was sort of the possible railroad lines. I wasn't entirely, that actually proved to be quite harder than I thought it was going to be, and I didn't even get to kind of show you what I was talking about. But
right,
it definitely is a possibility, like just from like the little tiny bit I found. And so I think that because of like the careful facial comparison I did between the unidentified person's reconstructed skull and the facial identification pictures of missing people, without anything else being taken into consideration, the only thing that was required was that the person had to have been reported missing before January 1st, 1990, because those are when the bones were found. And so obviously it would be, you wouldn't want to be looking for people that went missing in 2000 because that's 10 years later. But other than that, that was the only parameter. This is the guy I found, and then I made it work. Now, is it just me, speculating? Well, yeah, that's all it is. But this guy, the unidentified person, has been compared to a lot of people, and he's not any of the logical choices. So at that point, it's when you start thinking illogically. Now, it is an odd situation. I feel like I'm crazy just saying it, but I do sort of want to emphasize that it is me intentionally speculating because of sort of the circumstances. Walter Springer Lawton has not been excluded as being anyone. He's never, I don't know, he had daughters, but I don't know if there's DNA. I don't know, I don't really know why he hasn't been compared to anybody, except that there was nobody found around that area around that time that it seemed like he should be compared to. And that would make sense. But so going off of that, if you take a look at sort of the way the rail lines went around that time, the body was found, or the bones were found, it could have happened. It could have happened that way. From what I've seen, I don't think that it's going to end up being sort of foul play. It's going to seem to me, it seems more like an accident. And I think it was like crazy timing that.
It's almost death by misadventure the way it looks.
Right. And, you know, if he, let's say, for example, he passed out for some reason, fell over, there just happened to be a train there, and, you know, he ends up on the train and then he ends up falling off the train. And I think that could have happened in like the weirdest of circumstances without anybody ever even realizing what was going on.
And
like
that's
anybody involved. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, it happens so fast, and you end up in a situation where I guess this whole case sort of shows how you can defy a system. You can defy the entries on both sides.
Right. And to me, so let's say that he were to be a match, okay? It would illustrate my point perfectly about how this is why we've got all these missing and unidentified people in the system. Even though their partner is there in a lot of cases, it's not being matched because it's the wrong date or the wrong postmortem interval or something small is causing that connection to not be made.
In missing persons cases, and like you said, the postmortem interval is wrong. They can't estimate the height because there's only so many bones. I will say one of the things that was very convincing for me here, and you actually just said something else that reinforces it further. There were x-rays provided to the Pennsylvania State Police who have the missing persons case reflecting a broken left wrist. Now that you said encephalitis, which is interesting, the skull had damage. And I sort of sent you earlier, I think I screenshotted and sent over to you. I said the body was damaged, and you may have thought that I was referencing like the scattering, but what I was really referencing was it says that the decedent had numerous healed injuries consistent with a past motor vehicle accident, but one of those healed injuries was a craniotomy with 5 perfect perforations that were surgical and healed burr holes with a defect from the surgery on the left side and a healed fracture on the left side. But,
right, which would go right along with the details I would imagine would be involved with treating that, right? I don't know that for sure, and it's not mentioned. You know, this is probably pushing the envelope, but I'm squeamish. I don't like autopsy reports. I mean, healed injuries would be different, but I mean, if he took a tumble off of a railroad overpass bridge and hit a train to the extent that it knocked him out and he ended up dying for however it happened. I think that some of what I was seeing in the unidentified person's, sort of list of issues, I feel like could have been attributed to a really bad fall as well. Like it says car accident, but I mean, to me, it seemed like, so what I mean is like some of the injuries could be accounted for by the fact that he fell off the bridge.
Yeah, so they talk about the healed injuries and then they talk about other injuries. I'm not sure how deep you end up digging when you have partial remains found in the woods and you can see there's clearly been trauma and there's healed fractures. I don't know, like obviously they went to the expense and the time of doing a reconstruction. So someone was invested in this. And I just don't know how deep you dig to determine, how many separate old injuries versus new things you're dealing with when you've got scattered remains.
Right. And I think that that's one of the things that could be just someone's opinion. These look like they're, old injuries. And that's sort of hard for me to overcome because I will never be a doctor and I will never understand a lot of things that you would need to understand to make these determinations. But this case provides me with the opportunity to say things like this because he has been excluded as being so many people.
Right.
That for one thing, anything is possible, really. I mean, it really is. To tell the tale, I might not be exactly right. The missing person has to be somewhere, and the found body has to be someone. And I just put up a plausible scenario that could have occurred. I think that the fact that it was a postmortem interval of such a small amount of time, it could be for any number of reasons that was put there. And they may have had no idea. So they said, well, they died sometime last year. I mean, they didn't die next year, to that effect. And I think that was pretty commonplace for sort of my best guess answers to be thrown in there and not realizing what the repercussions would be like this far in the future. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I would do there to try and get it. So sometimes that interval could refer to tissue still being there. When you get to months and years, I don't necessarily think that's the case. And the way that I would probably try and preclude it in this situation would be to look at other exclusions they made, basically drill down on some of the exclusions to see what regions they were looking at, to see if they had looked at some Pennsylvania people, and to see what time frame they were looking at. Were they looking in the 70s? Does that make sense?
Right. No, yeah, and they weren't.
And that could be that they didn't, never how they answer either way. It goes to, you could confirm some things by looking at their exclusions, or you could realize that they missed some things looking at their exclusions, if that makes sense.
Right.
And I've looked at, there was one, we talked about mushroom pickers at one point, like people who are out doing things with ginseng and mushrooms tend to find bones. And I've looked at this one West Virginia case for years, and everyone I've ever thought it was is excluded now. And it's a woman that was found up there. And
really?
Yeah. I think you may remember that one because you and I have talked about it in the past. But I
have so many partial cases floating around in my head. This is the one I really wanted to include, right now. I have lots of them, but this one, and to my deep embarrassment, I guess I felt like it was so prominent it would forever be in my brain. And that was just not the case.
Right.
Because when I was like, oh, remember, and I was hoping you were going to remember.
Well, the minute I saw his face, I remembered.
Right.
Like the second I saw his face, and then so I pulled up the missing person, and I looked at it, and I was like, that face looks familiar. And then I clicked over and looked at the reconstruction, and I was like, oh, I know who this is.
Right. And so the face was what was in my mind, but I can't shoot an image of the face out of my eyeballs into the search function. So I had to go once again face by face until I found both of the two sides of that, and I have it down now, so hopefully that won't happen again. But he was one of the most fascinating things because not only did there are exclusions, but based on nothing else, the facial now, I heard a very well-respected homicide detective say that you can't always assess identity through looks. Okay. And then he referenced the fact that he had mothers identify bodies as their children only to have DNA show that it was not their child. I felt like he was probably exaggerating. I can't imagine how many mothers would accidentally identify somebody as their child, a dead body as their child that isn't actually their child. But that's what he said. And so that gave me pause. And cases have to be real special because I don't go sifting through the bodies found for unidentified people. I don't go looking through that very often because a lot of times you're looking at dead bodies.
Right.
And I don't really care to do that. But for whatever reason, I got this guy. I'm not sure how it all started, but when you get to a case that has all these exclusions and you're like, the man, it's a little old man. That's what the face of the reconstructed skull is. And it's a little old man who deserves to have his identity back, in my opinion. And so looking at him face by face. Now, in the meantime, I hear this detective say, well, that's not reliable. And I'm like, Oh, maybe it's not. But I would still I would have loved to have refound this case and found the exclusion there. Does that make sense? Like, oh, you're wrong.
Yeah.
It's not him. But that's not the case. And so I know at this point, I made the match at least a year ago. I don't know how long it's been, but it's been a while. And so he's still not excluded. And my fear is that without some help, and I don't even know, like, once you contact the Pennsylvania State Police, like, they may be like, there's no way that's him. And I disagree, because I do feel like there is a way that it's him. And the way is that somebody guessed at the postmortem interval, and it was, like, very short of, you know, what it actually was. And that it is one of the most bizarre cases of a person accidentally going missing and ending up 400 miles away that you're ever going to see. But just test it, right? I mean,
well, some of the other cases we talked about had jurisdictional anomalies with them as well, and so there's more to this as far, and you know, I don't know how much you care, but so referencing the homicide guy, the detective.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I'll say. I've actually been in the morgue in the last 2 weeks on a Wednesday night for the other stuff I'm doing. And I can say, like, from firsthand experience, like, first of all, none of that bothers me. And it's just a thing over time. It just doesn't do anything for me. I will say, though, one of the jobs of the reconstruction person is to give life. And that's different. So being able to look at a reconstruction and being able to look at a picture of a living person, that's correct. That's the way it's supposed to be. You're supposed to be looking at, you know, how a living person would look. But I will say that dead people do not look the same, and a number of ways. Like, so with what we're doing right now, most of those bodies are freshly deceased. The level that we're working at, they have been donated for, you know, anatomy and physiology purposes. So when you look at a body that's being autopsied, it's not as old as like a skull, which you know, it's probably pretty obvious to say, but the immediately lifeless do not look the same as living people. It is it's actually kind of jolting the first couple of times you see it. And I think the detective is right in that regard. With this particular case and the jurisdictional anomalies that come into play, if I don't get a response at all, like, typically they'll just acknowledge me. They may not divulge anything. Some of these older cases, they will. My next step is actually to go to the other side of it as well. So the Pennsylvania State Police get the missing persons tip, but then I go to Brunswick. The problem I had doing that today, and I don't know if you noticed this in the profile of the unidentified remains, they're currently assigned to a supervisor, and that supervisor, I just happen to have, like, pulled them up, and they're on a lot of stuff. So it has a pending assignment to what's known as a medico-legal death investigator. So when it goes to that guy at the OCME up there, I will message him as well. But,
well, I got some news for you there. I think that guy quit. Whoever did all those exclusions, he quit his job because he's like, there's no way I can't do this work. And I feel really bad for him because, like, I mean, if you had crossed that many people, you'd think you'd hit somebody.
Well, yeah, I mean, and maybe that is the case, but I do a little follow-up. The other follow-up is that one's interesting because it has a medical examiner attached to it, but it also has a sheriff's department investigator.
Or maybe they fired him because he did too many exclusions.
I'm not going to judge that. I'm not going to judge.
No, I'm just being silly. There could have been a number of people on that case over the years. I was just being funny about the different. I understand what you're saying. But you know, I had told you, actually, you and I had a discussion about this, and you probably don't remember, but there are several areas where you can tell whoever's working on the law enforcement end of a case in NamUs is enthusiastic, because that's where you get 1,000 exclusions as opposed to 0. And I think that this area is one of those areas that I found most of the remains found in that area were tested and tested often. And a lot of parameters were ignored. Like I don't think time necessarily would be ignored, but as far as somebody, from Virginia being found out in Washington, it didn't stop them from trying. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, so the Richmond Medical Examiner's Office, there's a lot of law enforcement training that goes on in this area, and there's also a lot. So this is where the FBI is sort of based, is in like the Virginia, Maryland area. And if you do big circles out from there, there's a lot of training that goes on here. So I think that's part of it, because I've noticed that too. As NamUs incepted and became a thing, I think you said something to the effect of, well, wow, whoever's working in Virginia is doing a lot of work.
Right. And that's true. And you don't find that many other places. I always, when I'm looking at whatever I'm looking at and my rabbit holes that I'm constantly in, I always take a look at exclusion, because, it's interesting to see who's been excluded. I think, the ultimate goal, and I'm sure that cost is probably an issue now, but I don't see it being an issue eventually. The ultimate goal is just to have DNA crossed automatically and it exclude people automatically. But I don't think, I know we're not there yet. I know some of these old cases are never going to have DNA attached to them. But I think I would be comfortable with DNA being automatically cross-referenced and kicked out. But when it's the other parameters that one little mistake can kick a match, that bothers me. And this case is one where I think that it could be a example. I don't know. It could be used as sort of an illustration of what I'm trying to say, because a lot of what I'm trying to say, I think, gets lost in translation. But I promise you it makes sense in my head. I did want to point out something additionally, to sort of bolster my claim. The unidentified remains were found. They were found with a shoe, and that shoe,
the blue track shoe.
Yes, and that was actually a very popular shoe in the 70s, not so much in the 90s. I just want to point that out.
It was a popular shoe in the 70s and the very early 80s. Yes.
But not in the 90s. And that's why
I went hunting for that shoe, and it was a problem for me, and I didn't resolve it yet, but I probably will by the time, I still reported the tip, but the shoe bothered me because if I recall correctly, I think it was more of a mid-70s thing, but I couldn't prove that, and I found a reference to them in 1971, so I sort of was like, okay, maybe I just need to get over that part. That's why when I was looking at the two dates, I was looking at 71 and 78, and I was like, 78 makes sense for that shoe because it would have been very popular. 71, I wasn't sure because it's a Kmart brand running shoe is what it is. I can picture it. I know exactly what it looks like without even looking at the NamUs picture. I knew what the shoe was.
Right, but you have to understand what I'm saying is from the perspective of the post-mortem interval being like months to a year in 1990. Okay.
I see what you're saying. You're saying that months doesn't make sense even if it's not this guy, it's more somebody from the 70s, 80s.
Right. And I feel like it lends more credence to what I'm saying as far as this being a better match because of the shoe brand. Now, why hasn't anybody noticed that? I have no idea, but the shoes were around. They actually, I believe it was 1970 on the dot, but I'm not sure. But I know what you're saying because they pop up as being more like 75, 76. That's when they had a lot more advertising and a lot more stuff that's going to be visual on the internet, archive type stuff.
Right.
And and then the other thing is his wife said he was wearing something different shoe-wise. I felt like she was probably mistaken. Now, that is a big leap that I normally wouldn't make. All right. I justified it because it's very easy to not know what your spouse is wearing on their feet. I think I could possibly look in my husband's closet and determine what's not there. But you have to remember they were on vacation, or they were new in this area. And so it's entirely possible that, she forgot that he was wearing his tennis shoes. And he didn't have I think she had said that he was most likely wearing slippers or sandals to go on a walk. And I was like, well, that's kind of strange, I think. And so to me, I justified it because to me, the tennis shoe actually makes more sense that he would have been wearing it. But if we went strictly by that, we would have to rule this guy out. But I'm just saying wild speculation is well deserved here. And so on the off chance that, in her mind, those shoes were the slippers, I don't know. I mean, there's a picture of the shoe with the unidentified remains. Does it have Velcro? Do you remember? I don't.
Yeah, they're Velcro. They're double Velcro.
Right. And so to me, those could just as easily be slippers. I mean, in somebody's mind.
Right. And along the same lines, I ran down they said he'd had the unidentified person had a craniotomy, which would not be common after the 70s for everybody.
Right. Okay. So you see what I'm saying here. You're getting what I just realized you're getting it. Okay, good.
Yeah, because I looked at that because that was actually replaced. The type of burr holes he has is done. It's very rare. It would have been done under different circumstances in the 70s versus the 80s, if that makes sense. And actually, for the condition that he had, it would have been a craniectomy, which is different than a craniotomy. And I'm not going to get into all of that here, but I did, like I said, it probably is earlier rather than closer to the 90s because of those things. And that's not the missing person side. That's on the other side. That's on the side of the
remains found,
right,
which lends to it more likely being, like I said, a longer postmortem interval than just. Now, is it possible that somebody just kept their shoes from the 70s and, they lived through the 70s and had the 70s treatment for that condition and they really did die in 1989? Well, sure, it's possible, but it's also very possible that the postmortem interval was just guessed at and cut short.
Right. And so that's sort of where this all ties into what we're doing related to Ted Bundy. And that's exclusions, how people make exclusions, not just in the case of unidentified remains or missing persons, but also because of what we're talking about, excluding people like Ted Bundy can be a huge mistake. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So when you are working in missing persons and unidentified persons, frequently you're working with death. Okay, so death is one thing, murder is another. So death, like if a murder has occurred, a death has occurred. But just because a death occurred doesn't mean a murder occurred.
Right, and so in this case, I don't feel like this guy was murdered. I feel like it was an accident at the worst.
Absolutely. And that's where we get into, I mean, could this be a murder? Absolutely. This we're not going to make a murderer, though, because we don't know. We just want to know who he is.
Wow, if all that really happened on top of, like, what I said happened, like, wow, just wow.
Yeah, that guy was having the worst day of his life if that all happened and he was murdered. In all likelihood, the reason Bundy was worth exploring for us for a second. I know it sounds crazy. It's because we do all these matches and we find all these different, like, pieces of the puzzles. Like, even just glancing at 1974 in Texas, which is a place nobody thinks of Ted Bundy, by the way. I just realized that.
Yeah, they don't.
But we did find some evidence of, like, Bundy might have been in Texas. And it's pretty much outside of the system of how homicide investigators would think. And it's also similar. So this guy, this unidentified person and the missing person take place in two completely different jurisdictions. And when I say completely, I mean two different states, two different cities, two different counties. So you would have If the FBI aren't involved, which they have no reason to be involved, if it's just the missing persons case from Pennsylvania, you have where he went missing in Pennsylvania, which was not even his home jurisdiction. You have the county that surrounds it, and you have the state of Pennsylvania. Where the body was found is Brunswick County in a little city, a little town, is this, state of Brunswick County, and that town's police organization. You have potentially 6 jurisdictions involved that don't even know they're supposed to be talking to each other in the 70s. And the body's not even found until the 90s.
Based on the information available now, it would be mentally excluded as a match by anybody who's not thinking like me, which is probably nobody. But somebody's worked really hard on this case. The 1,064 exclusions is a testament to that. That took time, effort, and energy for somebody to do. Having put in all that time in, I feel like one more won't hurt.
Exactly. And that's one more won't hurt for that guy, and one more look at Bundy and Texas won't hurt for the purposes of what we're doing, because I don't know how to explain to people how poorly that case was wrapped up with him. And
there was no wrap up. He was just put to death. There was no wrap up in his case.
And that blows my mind. I do want to ask you a question, if you have an opinion on it. How many double missing persons cases do you know of that ended in homicide? Let me
There's a time double missing people end up in homicide. It's so much less likely that so one scenario I would say that isn't a homicide. Typically, if somebody, including 2 or 3 people, go missing in a vehicle, it could be an accident. So that
in a lake or a body of water.
Body of water. In fact, I would guess 97% of cases with people that go missing in their vehicles, whether it's 1, 2, 3, or 4 people, I feel like those cars are in water somewhere. It's not like most cases. I don't chalk up double missing, triple missing to suicide. Definitely not. It's more likely foul play is involved in some way. Now, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily third-party foul play, but when you get into talking about teenage girls, 2 teenage girls going missing, or 2 young adult women or young girls, anytime you get into a couple of friends that have gone missing, I would bet dollars to donuts that it involves foul play.
And that's sort of the cases that we're looking at. There's one specific case in Texas that, you discovered this note that we're looking at. And I say you discovered the note, but the note is part of the missing case, but it's also part of something you discovered with Bundy.
Right. And I want to just sort of point out, and so where this comes from, one of the things that Bundy is known to have done, though he was not convicted of it, was the Lake Sammamish abductions. And so on July 14th, 1974, he successfully abducted 2 girls at 2 different times from 2 different places at the same function at Lake Sammamish in Washington. And I think that because of my mentality, the gloss over mentality I had towards Bundy before I sort of got into doing this part of it, I never quite considered what that event was actually, what it actually means for a person, for a man to have the nerve, the gall, whatever, to take 2 girls. So, okay, he took one. I believe he took Janice Ott first. And so he takes her. Terrible things happen to her. Has the nerve to go back and take another girl. Now, let's just let that soak in for a second, because it's so horrifying. I almost block it out because it's just so bad. But in that, and so in that ruse, what has been said is Bundy said he had his arm in some sort of like makeshift cast situation, and he said, I need somebody to help me put my boat on the car. And so he would lure a girl out to his car, and then she's like, where's the boat? And he's like, oh, we gotta go get it from my parents' house.
A wave of fear swept all across the state of Washington.
Hawkins was last seen Monday evening
when someone was abducting young women.
It's hard to say whether there's any foul play or not.
There was incredible pressure on law enforcement to find the person who was responsible for causing these women to go missing. It was an ultimate challenge.
Thank you very much for calling. Anything?
What cleverness or what sophistication of the suspect are you looking for that can manage to pull that off?
There were no clues whatsoever. I mean, it's kind of remarkable that nobody saw anything, but Lake Sammamish was another story.
Lake Sammamish State Park was huge. It was a magnet for all of us, young and old.
Like a place you would go to in the Midwest or something, with this old-fashioned concession stand and people just coming out with their little sailboats or coming out to sun.
July 14th, 1974, the place was absolutely packed. There were 40,000 people there.
A number of people that day at Lake Sammamish were taking photos and shooting film. Well, little did they know the police would want to review this footage.
Ted was able to meld into the crowd. He was wearing casual beach-type clothing. He was able to strike up conversations with people. He was able to convince Denise Naslund and Janice Ott to help him with the ruse that he had a sailboat, that he had his arm in a fake sling.
If anybody has seen The Silence of the Lambs, where the killer had trying to get that couch into the van and he's got a cast on, that all came from Ted Bundy.
Can I help you with that?
Would you?
Sure.
Bundy was a real schemer.
Remember that these abductions were benign on the face of them. They were always Bundy approaching the women in a state of presumed need or weakness. Can you help me carry my books? My arm's in a sling. Can you help me load my sailboat onto my car?
There were 3 women that saw Janice Ott roll her bicycle up to the beach and lay it down. And she had on a yellow bikini. And then they observed this man walk up to her. And they heard her get up and say, "Hi, I'm Jan." And he said, "I'm Ted." He gave his real name. She was last seen headed toward the parking lot, pushing her bike with him walking next to her. And then she's never seen again. We did have about 5 or 6 other women come forward that said that they had been approached by the guy with his arm in a sling. And they looked just like Janice Ott and Denise Naslund.
Some went as far as the parking lot, saw the Browns Volkswagen Bug, but no boat. And at that point, he said, "Oh, the boat's up at my folks' house in Issaquah. It'll just take a minute." Those women backed off. But Janice Ott left walking with him at noon and never came back.
First, Janice went missing, and that was earlier in the morning. She disappeared, and then later he came back to the park. The time difference, one was about 10, the other was about 4:30.
McCartney and Wings, Junior's Farm, KJR, Seattle, and Kevin O'Brien at 4:09.
It was a Sunday afternoon, and my buddy and I had this great idea. Well, hey, let's take a break. Let's go down to the lake. Maybe we can grab something to eat. And we noticed off to the side this guy just a few feet from us standing in front of the women's bathroom, and he was dressed in nice casual clothes. But the oddest thing about it is he had a cast on his arm.
It's 417 KJR, Seattle, and you're
So we were going to, actually, being a couple of smart aleck teenagers, we were thinking maybe razzing the guy a little bit. But it turned out it was our turn to get ice cream. So we, lost track of the guy, didn't think anything more about it.
And that's when Denise Naslund was abducted. Those abductions were very brazen and in front of literally thousands of witnesses, but the witnesses did not know what they were seeing.
With regard to Denise Naslund, her car is in the parking lot. Her purse is still there. Her keys to her car are still there. But she's not. She's gone.
Who does that? He wasn't satiated with just one. I think he was trying to make a statement that day.
For Ted, the thrill of going back to where he had been successful in the morning and being able to abduct another woman was probably very exciting for him.
It was almost theatrical the way two women disappeared. It was as if the stakes of the story had been raised in this dramatic way.
It was also critical that people who were at the park that day, who were taking photographs of their friends and family, any filming that they had done, turned over their photographs and filmed to us to see if we could find something that would be a clue.
The Lake Sammamish abductions would come back to bite Bundy. People saw him, and he identified himself as Ted.
There's a Ted, and he drives a Volkswagen, and he's handsome.
And from the witnesses that saw him were composite drawings made.
When the picture came out, when they finally got a Ted Bundy picture of this person of interest, no question in our minds, no question that this was the guy.
Each lead has to be followed. Every phone call has to be made. Most lead nowhere. Some pan out with a speck of information that may someday help clear up the mystery of the whereabouts of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund.
And it was a very creepy sensation knowing that we were just steps away from somebody who is ultimately responsible for doing some very, very, very dastardly deeds.
One thing, since the publication of the description of the man called Ted, there have been no further disappearances from this area. John Sandifer for ABC News in Seattle.
But isn't it crazy?
Oh, it is crazy that he took. So he takes Janice Ott first, and then he takes Denise Naslund. Yeah, it's absolutely crazy.
And they didn't know each other. They weren't together. They weren't he. Sort of my thought process is, and I don't know because it's a point of pride for me that I am. I don't know what is in a psychopath's brain or a sociopath's brain, but. So what was Ted Bundy thinking? In my mind, okay, you go and you take a girl and you kill her and you do whatever he did with her, and then he goes and gets another girl. How is that, even for the very worst serial killer, how is he able to do that? I feel like
compartmentalizing it.
Is that what it is? Because to me, a recovery period would be absolutely essential from even, I assume, the anticipation, the anxiety, then, his satisfaction of doing it, I guess. And then to come down from all that, that's a really quick period of time there for him to take two girls like that. And it's overwhelming to me. Well, for one thing, that totally should have been prosecuted, and he should have, how many more times can we put him to death? Well, it's not just about killing him. it's about justice for really terrible crimes. Like I said, I've glossed over it, but it was such a bad thing. Well, then start thinking about, typically missing people, you can chalk it up to other things besides foul play. But then when you get a group of young adult girls that go missing, you go, wait, that's harder to account for without bringing a third party into the mix.
Yeah, and so that's sort of the point here is, so what we're dealing with in this episode, there's the Fort Worth trio, and they have some varying theories, including that they, ran off, that family was involved in what happened to them, or that a group of people was involved in what happened to them. But then they actually mention, if you look through, there's two different serial killers they mentioned that were in that area. One was in Fort Worth, one was nearby, and that's Bell and this guy Mike. I can't remember how to say his last name. I think it's DeBoblin. They sort of put Edward Harold Bell in that group, and they put James Mike DeBoblin in that group, but they're not the same as a Bundy. And so Bundy, you already have evidence that he pulls women from multiple places, multiple women from the same place. And the cases that we're looking at aren't just the Fort Worth trio. We're looking at 1974 double homicides of young girls. And we know one of Bundy's rules was he was never going to contest to cases of girls who were very young. And you brought up an interesting question, which was how young is too young? And I don't know that we have an answer to how young is too young for Bundy, but what we do have is we can look at maybe some of the cases that he didn't want to admit to. With the Fort Worth trio, it involves a 9-year-old girl.
I am doing another unsolved mystery. I have really enjoyed the past few ones I've done, so I have to do a Christmas unsolved mystery. Sure, as you guys could tell by the title, I'm going to be talking about the Fort Worth missing trio. This took place in Fort Worth, Texas. I'm going to try to not complicate this story as much as possible. Brief synopsis of this whole case is on December 23rd, 1974. 3 girls went shopping in the morning in Fort Worth, Texas. Their names were Mary Rachel Trilka. I'm so sorry, I am mispronouncing that. And she was 17. Lisa Renee Wilson was the other girl, and she was 14. And Julie Ann Mosley was the third girl, and she was 9. They all went Christmas shopping at Seminary South Shopping Center in Fort Worth, Texas. They were supposed to return home at 4 p.m., but they never returned. Let's just get into the persons who disappeared. Rachel, like I said, was 17 at the time of this disappearance, and she was 5'6", 108 pounds. She had brown to blonde hair, green/blue eyes. Her upper front tooth was chipped, and she has a small scar on her chin. Her maiden name is actually Arnold. She was left-handed, and the left-handed information will be important later, so keep that in mind. Lisa, which we are going to refer to as Renee, as I previously said, she was 14 at the time of this disappearance. She was 5'2" and weighed 110 pounds. She had brown hair with reddish highlights and brown eyes. She had a scar on her thigh. She was last seen wearing red and white sneakers and a pale yellow-green shirt that said "Sweet Honesty" across the front of it. Julie was 9 at the time of the disappearance. She was 4'3" and weighed 85 pounds. She had light brown hair and blue eyes. She also had a scar under her left eye and a scar in the middle of her forehead, as well as on the back of her calf. Rachel, the oldest girl that went missing, she was a high school student. She was also married to a guy named Thomas Rilliga. Sorry, once again. They had been married for about 6 months. Rachel and Renee being the second oldest girl who went missing, they had been friends for a very long time. And on December 23rd, Rachel invited Renee to go shopping with her. Renee agreed to go. How Julie, the 9-year-old, got involved in going was she lived across the street from Renee's grandmother, but she did not know Rachel at all. She begged to go with them because she did not want to spend her morning home alone. Rachel's older sister, Deborah, had previously been engaged to Rachel's husband, Thomas. Apparently, whenever Thomas and Rachel got together, it was not awkward and she was over it. Deborah had recently came to live with Rachel and Thomas, and it was reported that it was also not uncomfortable at all, the three of them living there. Deborah was actually invited to go shopping that day. She said that she didn't want to go, that she just wanted to stay in bed and get some more rest. Renee, the 14-year-old who went missing, was dating Julie, 9-year-old that went missing's older brother, Terry. Terry was also invited to go shopping with them. He went to hang out with a sick friend instead. That morning that they went missing, Terry had given Renee a promise ring, so that way Renee could attend a party with Terry. On December 23rd, the girls headed out before noon and stopped at an Army-Navy store to get some stuff that had been left on layaway for Christmas. And after that, they traveled to the Seminary South Shopping Center. There, they parked their Oldsmobile on the upper level near Sears. While they were at the mall, several people witnessed them. A few people remembered seeing them because of Renee's Sweet Honesty shirt. Apparently, at some point during that day, they made it back to their car because the car was found with some wrapped presents in the backseat floorboard. That was about 6 p.m. whenever those were discovered. Even though the presents were there were no sign of the girls. Initially, the police thought that the girls ran away because of a letter that had been mailed to the Trillica residence on December 24th of that year. The letter was addressed to Thomas and had the name Rachel written in the upper left corner of the envelope. Here's what the letter said. I know I'm going to catch it, but we just had to get away. We are going to Houston. See you in about a week. The car is in the Sears upper lot. Love, Rachel. The letter was addressed to Thomas, but Rachel rarely called him Thomas and majority of the time called him Tommy, not Thomas. So if she wrote a letter to him, she probably would have called him Tommy in it, not Thomas. There was no city on the postmark of this letter, only a blurry postal number. The family says that new DNA technology found that the letter did not in fact belong to Rachel, that she in fact did not write it. The letter was apparently written by someone who was right-handed, so Rachel most likely did not write this because she was left-handed, not right-handed. The letter, it is said, was actually mailed from Fort Worth, so the same city that they disappeared from. They have never been able to identify who actually wrote and sent the letter. Thomas was the one who got the letter out of the mailbox himself. Also, the letter was canceled the morning that it arrived at the Trillica residence. I didn't know what a letter being canceled meant before this, so I Googled it, and what I could find about a letter being canceled is kind of like how it sounds. Pretty much, if you put a stamp on a letter, you can cancel a letter that you're sending, so that way someone can't take that stamp off and use it to mail something else. I don't know if the letter not being canceled could have traced back to someone. One witness reported seeing them hustled into a pickup truck. Another witness said that they saw a man forcing them into a van, and then whenever they confronted the man told them that this was a family dispute and that they needed to stay out of it. Another witness said that they saw the girls with a security guard and that they were supposedly riding around in the security guard's pickup truck. The witness apparently saw the girls riding around with the security guard at about 11:30 p.m., 7.5 hours after they were supposed to have been home. Apparently, the security guard, the girls did not look like they were in danger. They seemed relaxed, like they were in his vehicle willingly, not like he had just forced them in and taken them. 7.5 hours after you're supposed to have been home. Let's say they got to the mall about 1. That's almost 12 hours. It's a pretty long time that they would have been in this mall area. Authorities have said that they have looked into all of these witness reports, but none of them can be confirmed by authorities, and the security guard denied that the girls are ever in his truck. Members of the girls' family believe that Rachel's older sister, Deborah, knows more than she is letting on, and that she might have had something to do with the disappearance of the girls, but there is no evidence of this at all. This is just speculation. Deborah also denies that she had absolutely anything to do with these girls' disappearance, and that she thinks that the girls were forced into slavery. Rusty, Rachel's younger brother, located private investigator Dan James in 1999. This private investigator said that he believes the witness reports that Rachel and Renee were seen alive days after their disappearance at stores and at gas stations. However, they believe that Renee and Julie are both now deceased. I don't know why they believe that. There was not any information as to why that is believed. Rusty and the private investigator also believe that Rachel is being kept from the Fort Worth area. They don't know who she is being kept by. Apparently, there were witness reports of seeing Rachel in the Fort Worth area in Christmas of 1998. Rusty and the private investigator refused to release any information or evidence supporting these claims, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't any evidence. Detectives, however, have said that they are actively looking at 5 suspects, and that the girls left the mall with someone they trusted and were harmed afterwards. That, sadly, is all of the information for this case. I don't know what happened to these girls. There's so little evidence in this case that it's hard to come up with plausible theories for this case. I couldn't really find out why people believe that Deborah is a suspect. And then there's all of these witness reports saying that they saw different things. There's just a lot of speculation, not a lot of evidence.
That was the whole goal. We just had to know. All these people, they want to know. They want to know the truth. You know, all these years we've been waiting. And we came across these cars, and it was really suspicious. It was right by everything that happened that day. My mind right now is wanting to see what the hell's in this car, if there's anything in it at all. And soon after that, after we find out there's nothing in it, if there's nothing in it, I'm ready for that next car. You can imagine, I feel nothing but love today. Can you imagine this? Look at all these people, man. I got so much support and so much love in my heart. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It really is. Like I said on the web the other day, maybe someday, somewhere, we'll meet. Love you.
Divers pull second car from lake and are searching for clues in the missing Fort Worth trio case. As Rusty Arnold watched a muddy, dripping car hauled from Benbrook Lake on Saturday, he had one predominant hope, that his sister's remains might be inside. Arnold has waited 44 years for answers about Fort Worth's second oldest missing persons case. He has good reason. His 17-year-old sister was one of 3 girls who disappeared after a trip to the mall around Christmas in 1974. Over the past few months, Arnold, a team of divers and dozens of volunteers have sought answers at the bottom of Benbrook Lake, located about 8 miles from the shopping center the girls went to that day. The second of 3 cars at the bottom of the lake was recovered Saturday, and, while the vehicle did not contain answers, its recovery puts the community closer to finding answers in the case of the missing Fort Worth trio. Searching for remains. In 1974, 17-year-old Rachel Trillica, 14-year-old Lisa Renee Wilson, and 9-year-old Julie Mosley set out on a shopping trip to what was then the Seminary South Shopping Center in South Fort Worth. They were supposed to be home by 4 p.m., but they never returned. Arnold was 11 when the girls went missing. His sister Rachel's disappearance has haunted him his entire life. "When you're 11, all you know is that you miss your sister," he said. His parents wouldn't go to the mall Rachel disappeared from, and they wouldn't let him out of their sight. When he was older, however, Arnold started investigating Rachel's disappearance himself. He turned to Lake Benbrook since it was so close to where the girls were last seen. He said the police described the missing trio case as active and open, but it does not appear they are making new strides in the investigation. The cars in the lake, he said, was not a strong enough case for the police to look into, so he took upon himself to search them. Over the past months, divers, Arnold, other family members and the community raised about $15,000 to search the lake, where divers eventually located 3 cars. They believe one of those cars is connected to a person of interest in the case. "In a perfect world, we're looking to find the bodies of the girls in the car," Arnold said. On September 22nd, the first car was finally pulled from the water after 2 hours of towing. At about 2 p.m. Saturday, the second car breached the surface. Rachel and Arnold's mother, Fran Langston, were nearby as the rusted car was towed onto a truck. "I'm hoping they open that trunk and find remains," the 80-year-old woman said. "All these years, we've been waiting." Arnold said he and his mother are not the only ones searching for answers. A community shaken by the unsolved case, which became known as the missing Fort Worth Trio, has followed the investigation for decades. The retrieval of the cars only reignited the public's absorption in the case, and the Facebook group about the missing girls grew to over 11,000 members in the past few weeks. "We just had to know. All these people, they want to know," Arnold said Saturday, gesturing to the surrounding crowd. "They want to know the truth. All these years we've been waiting." The wait, however, did not end on Saturday. Cheers erupted from about 100 people who were gathered at the lake as the car, a rusted Lincoln Continental, was pulled right side up onto the shore. After the car's VIN number ran, however, it was clear the car had nothing to do with the missing trio. The car was a 1976 Lincoln. The girls went missing in 1974. Arnold barely seemed to miss a beat and, within minutes, was already planning the next dive. "We're eager to look at the next one," he said. "And ready to move on." Arnold said they don't know when the next dive will be to pull the third and final car from the lake, but when the time comes, he may be joining the divers. Next month, he said, he's planning to become a certified diver. When that happens, he'll be able to join the rest of the team in searching the lake's murky waters himself. "We're not giving up, we're not going away. Ever," he said.
Identified people in Utah, and I think it's the Fort Worth Trio. I know they weren't in Utah, but he's talking about where he killed them.
Right. And so I think that it's possible. I think I'm following what you're saying. And I think that that could be possible because he doesn't mention Texas.
Right.
I don't know like what his line of thinking would be. It comes up at some point, and this would be later. So he says, you know, where do I have to go to get the death penalty? And his attorney tells him, you've got to go to Florida or Texas. But that's much later. So I don't know that would have, the location being in Texas, I don't know that would have weighed in at that point. But
well, I don't think he killed them there.
Right, but they were still taken from there. So, you know, as far as jurisdictionally, I mean, they would have jurisdiction to bring some charges against him if he were caught.
He just might not have been enough to get him the death penalty is what he was thinking. So why bother confessing to it? Because it also involved a little girl.
Well, that's the reason why I think that he didn't confess to it. Or I think that to listen to Bundy talk in his, you know, confession tapes or whatever, I don't think he's, I know he's not telling the whole truth. Even across the accounts of his confessions, like the numbers aren't the same. Like, you know, 36, 30, over 100, add a digit to one of those. And I don't know what to think. And to me, like one more person is one more person, you know, so it's not a matter of it being like 30 or 36. That's 6 people difference. And that's a lot of people to have died at his hands and for it to be glossed over, sort of. It irritates me because I don't know, like I haven't got it in my head yet who is more accurate or I do feel like we had talked about before that with Agent Hagmeyer, he wasn't as, I think he was honest, but I don't think he was like forthcoming. Maybe not honest, but I think he developed a relationship with Bill Hagmeyer, Agent Hagmeyer, because he was there. But I don't know that he was as, he didn't want to make Agent Hagmeyer think badly of him. I don't know if that makes sense, but like I could just I get the sense that he dulled things down for him, or because that's who he was talking to. Now, I completely lost my train of thought.
Well, you were talking about you weren't sure what to believe as far as numbers go with him.
Right. And so you had said he has confessed to 3 unidentified bodies. Now, okay, that's what launched me into this sort of. So I look at different accounts of it, and I haven't gotten like what I feel like is the, like what I'm going off of yet. Does that make sense? And so,
yeah,
having that in mind, you know, I sent you a very wide list of like very wide possibilities. So I would narrow down more, but those are narrowed down already. And I don't know. I know that there are a few that he didn't know enough about to give investigators their identity. And then even from just what you listen to, he talks about how he can't talk about that right now. Something to that effect. Yeah. When he's asked about certain victims. Surprisingly, though, he confesses to some in great detail, apparently. It leaves me wondering, like, oh, okay, well, yes, he said there's 3 bodies in Utah. Does that mean there's 3 bodies? I would say there's at least 3. I think that the way we mapped out the route from Salt Lake City going to Fort Worth and back, like we sort of figured he would have had to have done in this particular case, I think that it is most likely that their bodies are in Utah. Yeah.
I think at least 2 of them are. I'm not sure about the third one or not, but I think 2 of them are, and possibly all 3. So laying out my case really quickly with you, because you said some things this morning that I wanted to try and capture. I know we have older recordings on this, but I'm just trying to make sure I have it all. So, by the way, I fell down this rabbit hole with El Dorado Jane Doe that just like sucked away all my sense of this, and that's why I'm recounting it for you now. There's handwriting in this case that was attributed to Tommy, who was the husband of Rachel. She's the oldest girl from the Fort Worth trio. Now, it's not attributed to him until like 2012, and really all they're saying is that it's possibly a male's handwriting. They're not really saying it's his. They're just saying it's possibly male.
Really?
Yeah. So
I haven't heard that part.
Well, I can't get a document verifying. And it's
okay.
Also,
well, I don't know about that, but what I will say is from a completely narrow, speculative view, I absolutely agree that a guy could have written it. And what I had told you earlier was there's one sort of dead giveaway. And if you have the opportunity to take a look at the addressed envelope and the letter that Rachel Trilica supposedly sent to her husband, we speculate that Bundy drove there, got the girls, and drove back. Right. So it was addressed to Thomas Trilica, and the dead giveaway to me was, if you can look at the addressed envelope and the letter, and you can find any letter from Ted Bundy to any person ever that's handwritten or signed by him, he signs his name, Ted, T-E-D, with a T that unmistakably looks like a lowercase t, because he doesn't put the line on the top, rather through the loop that he makes to make the what I consider to be a lowercase t. Now, when you look at it, do you see a lowercase t?
Oh, I think they match. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that I think that everything that you said is correct.
Okay. But here's the giveaway though. So, look at Ted Bundy's signature and notice, it looks like a lowercase t. And then look at the letter addressed to Thomas Trilica. I can only say it if I repeat it right after you. Thomas Trilica. And you will see that Texas is the exact same lowercase t that Ted Bundy uses to sign his name. Now, why is that important? Well, Texas should be capitalized, and it's not. Ted should be capitalized, and he doesn't capitalize it. The rest of it, I mean, there are other similarities throughout the context that you can match up or say don't match Ted Bundy. But I think that particular thing, making what should be a capital T a lowercase t, and I don't even know that Ted Bundy did that consciously, because if he had just aimed a little higher, it wouldn't have looked like a lowercase t. But that is what kind of seals the deal for me in believing it. I think handwriting is a very malleable thing. And it was a direct comparison. It's not like I could look at the letter and say, without a direct comparison, oh yeah, Ted Bundy wrote this, right?
Right.
It's a comparison. I don't have samples of Rachel's handwriting. I looked at what I could find similar characteristics of, and Bundy's handwriting changed over time. It actually got a lot better the longer that he was in prison. So,
the more he practiced.
Right. That characteristic of this sort of weird T that's part of Ted's signature, and then the Texas, it matches. They look exactly alike if you put them side by side. And it's kind of weird. It's a weird attribute. I'll keep a lookout and see, not that I get that many hand printed addresses these days, but how many people write out the entire state for one thing instead of just putting TX.
Right.
It was written out, Texas. And that's what Bundy did on all of his course. Well, I don't know about all of it, but the samples I could find, he always even California, he wrote out the entire state.
Right, which is unusual.
It is. And then to not capitalize the T, except I think to Bundy, like that lowercase t was a capital T or whatever. And it's a weird thing because normally people would have put TX with a capital T. Or if they put Texas, they would put a capital T to start the word because, it's a proper noun. So additionally, there was an article in the paper that indicated that Rachel's husband, Tommy, had possibly lost some documents in his car after
a couple of $50 bonds and supposedly a copy of the will that his parents had left.
Right. And so I was thinking that they would have all had the name Thomas on it as opposed to Tommy, so that makes me think, okay, and this is so speculative and I hate to even say it. So I don't know if you want to use it or not, you can decide. But so to me, that says that by the time he had sent that in the mail in Texas, because he had to have done that, he could no longer ask Rachel the name.
Right. I think probably the only one that was conscious was the little girl, to be honest. I mean, it's speculative on my part as well, but I think the other two were probably unconscious, Bundy style.
Right. And so so my question had always been going sort of along with if it was somebody that wanted to do something to one of them. There was such a dissonance between these three girls, Rachel and Julie having barely known each other at all. It seemed weird that like they could just wait until whichever girl they had the issue with was alone and not, have to deal with the other two.
Well, so there's this idea that it said Rachie instead of Rachel, and that had to be corrected. And I thought that the little girl would have called her Rachie. And that he realized it looking through the paperwork that he's got from the glove box that he had to change that to Rachel, and he addressed everything to Thomas because there's nobody there to tell him Tommy. I don't think the 9-year-old would have been unconscious. So with the whole idea of taking those 3 girls, I think that definitely the older girl is going to be like a typical Bundy. She's going to be having hit, and she's going to be loopy or unconscious. Depending on the vehicle that he puts them in, she's going to be in the back. The little girl's going to be closer to the front and much easier to control. I don't think he's going to knock her out if it's Bundy. And, the other thing that comes into play here for me is it is a note written to a woman from a man that possibly was written by a man. That is unusual. Like
it is very.
And we have evidence of Bundy doing that at least one other time. And that's what makes me think if he's rifling through stuff in that home to write that note in Aspen, Colorado, in the area around Aspen, Colorado in 1977, he's possibly done it before. This matches Bundy.
It does.
I bet they've never tested the DNA against Bundy.
So what I had said was going along with the fact that I felt like if somebody had an issue with just one of the girls, these Rachel and Julie hardly knew each other. And it's not like they were together all the time. This was a Christmas break shopping trip. Why not just wait until whoever they had the issue with was alone so they didn't have to deal with the other two? Well, going along with that, why was Rachel the only one who left a note? That's the only information that he could find was the stuff that he had taken when that was missing from the car when it was returned after it was found and the girls weren't found. Does that make sense?
That's so weird though.
It is weird, but I think it's weirder that the oldest would send a note to her husband. Now, granted, it did say where the car was, but why wouldn't they take in the car with them?
Okay, so that's one of the things that came up. And so the car is weird. And first of all, I think it's just to throw time between things. You know what I mean? Like to throw him off the idea of them being abducted just long enough for him to get back to Salt Lake City.
Yeah, sure. But I'm saying, like, why, if the girls were going to Houston, why didn't they drive there?
That's a great question. How do they expect that they got there?
That in the examples that we have, which is basically Carol Durant, her kidnapping, and how this would have gone down would have been Bundy would have used a ruse to get the girls to think that he was somebody, a security guard, a police officer, somebody they could trust. And something happened to the car, and then just like with Carol Durant, they end up in the vehicle with him. The vehicle the girls were in would have been left sitting there. Now, one of the interesting things that I saw somebody had said about this particular case was they could never get the girls out of the parking lot. Like they literally couldn't find any leads. It was like they just vanished. And I think that could be just like if Carol Durant hadn't been successful at fighting him off, that's what would have happened to her. She would have vanished. Her car would have been left sitting in the parking lot, just like their car was left sitting in the parking lot. Another thing that I felt was pretty interesting. Okay, so Rachel drives herself and the other two to the mall, and then they leave the car there, and they leave to go to Houston. Something important to remember is this was Christmas, and they have a 9-year-old with them.
The note arrived on, so they spent the day, Christmas Eve was spent wondering, where were these girls?
In the note, it says, be back next week or something like that. Like, we're going to Houston, be back next week. A 9-year-old is not going to skip Christmas with her family.
No, they're going to be a giant pain in the ass the whole time.
Right. And taking the time for Rachel to rate, which, by the way, her sister was staying with Rachel and her husband at the time, and she was not able to find any paper and nor the pen that it appeared the note was written on and with. So, like, where did that stuff come from? It was kind of weird because nothing, if she was sending that note to throw, if Rachel legitimately sent it, wouldn't she have written the note at home? It's not like they decided in the spur of the moment.
Right, the origin of the note, but she also wouldn't have addressed it to Thomas. But neither would, so if Tommy did this, he wouldn't have written it that way. And there was some speculation that Tommy and Deborah had something to do with it. Deborah is living with them at the time. So Deborah wouldn't have addressed it to Thomas. None of them would. This is a stranger. This is not someone they knew.
Someone who copied the name and address off of the stuff he got out of the glove box. That's my opinion. I mean, because once I saw that stuff was taken, I was like, well, that makes perfect sense because he didn't think any differently, which is weird because his name is Theodore and he goes by Ted, and apparently he really hated being called Theodore, which makes me want to call him Theodore all the time. But so it's weird he didn't think of that.
But anybody else would have dealt with the car differently. If it was someone close to them, they would have dealt with the car differently. It's a stranger.
Oh, no question. I agree. Now, there was a lead that I felt was interesting. I don't know that it was corroborated. I know that, what I had said about they never got them out of the parking lot, even though they've tried and tried and tried, they can't. There was somebody who had come forward at some point, and so the trail to this witness was not clear, because I think when they went to try and, follow up or whatever, they couldn't find her. But there was an account from somebody they spoke with during the initial investigation indicating that she saw a man trying to put a little girl, now it doesn't elaborate on how little the girl was, but a girl in a van. The man said, this is a family deal. You stay out of it. Like when somebody said, hey, what are you doing? He was like, this is a family ordeal. Stay out of it. Now, the reason I thought of that and thought of Ted Bundy was because there's also an account much later. Kimberly Leach, a fireman who had gotten off duty, was stopped behind a van, which was the van Ted Bundy had stolen. And he was basically dragging Kimberly Leach, and he put her in the car. And that's exactly what that guy thought, was like, oh, that dad just got called to come pick his child up from school because of some reason or another. And the guy actually felt bad. He was like, man, I was thinking to myself, somebody's going to get a whooping, And so they kind of parallel each other as far as giving the impression of being a father who was dealing with, a child who was not behaving.
Right. And so that's interesting. But Bundy didn't say anything about it. That's just the guy's impression of it.
Bundy didn't say anything about it, no.
Okay.
About which one, though?
Kimberly Leach.
Bundy, well, okay, so, a lot of the facts were corroborated in that he did take her from school. He did have a van, like that kind of stuff was, but he didn't give the account of him trying to make it look like a domestic thing. It's just the age that he was, and then to somebody who I don't know, wouldn't look real carefully, he could have very well had a daughter that age, and that could have very well been what was happening. And I think that in normal everyday life, we go to things like that as opposed to that child is being abducted by a serial killer.
Yeah, and that's the other thing was the 74 case, serial killing was new. Like this type of killing happening, it happened, but like I don't think people fully grasped the idea that stranger danger, although rare, was real.
Right. It was very, very rare. And so when I read through that lead that they had gotten, and then they couldn't follow up. So I don't know what the deal was with that. I don't know if they eventually were able to follow up on it. But I thought to myself, yeah, so, he knocks the two older girls on the head. For whatever reason, he can't do that to the younger girl, and she probably freaks out and is trying to get away. And he drags her into the van, and it looks like a father, dealing with his daughter who wanted a toy before Christmas and she can't have it or something like that.
Yeah. So the proximity in time, the note, the fact that the timing is even possible, and the 3 unidentified victims in Utah, to me, all line up to be, I personally think that if they dug deep into the handwriting analysis, dug deep into the DNA samples that they have available, because they're saying it's from the envelope, I think this is going to be Ted Bundy.
Well, I certainly think it's worth checking. And in fact, if they don't want to check it and they'll give me the profiles, I'll check it. I mean, seriously, I think it's worth a look.
Right. And so, all right. So where we end up in this episode is we've speculated the hell out of the Fort Worth trio.
Right.
And, I've cut around some stuff here by the time this goes through edit and I finalize it. But we get this, like, the chronology of this is like all out of order.
Right.
We were only tagging on to this because you found the note, and that note is from 1977. But there was this weird note in this 1974 case, which is the Fort Worth trio. So we have to go backwards now because we started looking at Bundy. And
right.
I think the next period of time is actually before this in 1974, and that is Bundy mentions, talking about unidentified victims, so to speak. He mentions a hitchhiker.
Right.
And he said something weird about the hitchhiker, and that stood out to you, which is sort of how he started this whole track. But since we're re-recording this, I'd just like to have it in a better quality.
Sure.
When he's talking about hitchhikers, what stood out to you there?
Well, because he was confessing to, this was, very close to when he was about to be executed, and he was buying time. But something that stood out to me was that he said he had killed an unknown, so he didn't know her name, hitchhiker, a young girl that he had picked up who was either from Wyoming or Montana. And I thought that was strange. And the reason I say that is because if somebody tells me they're from somewhere, except for possibly like North Dakota or South Dakota, like you might forget if they said North or South, but for the most part, you're not going to mix up Wyoming and Montana. It's weird. It stuck out in my head because I thought, well, that's really strange because he picked this hitchhiker up in Idaho, which he remembers, and then he remembers she was either from Wyoming or Montana. And so it just, I don't know, it stuck out as really strange to me because as much as he ever did, I think he was trying to give them as best of an account of what had happened as he could. And it just didn't seem like that made sense. But then I start looking. I find information about a young girl who went missing around the right time frame for her to be this unknown victim. And she lived in Montana and was visiting Wyoming.
definitely possible that she could have been in Idaho or right near the Idaho border.
Right. So she had left, and there's obviously this is speculation. Based on a lot of things, a lot of information that I've processed through my head, I am 99.9% sure that is who the hitchhiker is that Bundy confesses to killing. Why nobody's put it together, I don't know, but I imagine when he picked her up, she made mention that she lived in Montana and was visiting Wyoming. And when she did that, his brain because he didn't care, right? He didn't care where she was from or what was going on, but he did hear those two things. And that's why, all those years later, so this would have been in 1989. So 15 years later, he can't remember if she was from Montana or from Wyoming. And it makes perfect sense to me that that's his victim, the unknown hitchhiker that he picked up in Idaho when he was on his way to Utah.
Yeah, and it lines up really perfectly that he was going back and forth between Seattle and Salt Lake City during this time when she went missing. So she's the next step, because I want to look at her in the next thing that we do, but I also want to look at similar cases to that in California, because we've been wondering, who are the victims in California? So that I would say it's a fork in the road, but really the next thing that we're doing isn't really a fork in the road. It's just which hitchhikers did he kill? It's almost a limerick.
Yeah.
So that will be what we pick up in the next episode. Will be hitchhikers.
Thanks for joining us. You can reach us at 252-365-5593 or at truecrimexcess.com or truecrimexcess@gmail.com if you want to send us a note. This episode was brought to you by LabrottieCreations.com. That's LabrottieCreations.com. Check out the merchandise and specifically their fun Pop Pet art custom pieces made from photos of your very own pets. Use the promo code CRIMEXS, that's CRIMEXS, for 20% off a fun, brightly colored, happy piece of art of your own pet at their site, LabrottieCreations.com. Music in this episode was licensed for True Crime XS. The theme song was Indestructible by Noah Smith. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform or at TeePublic, Instagram, or Twitter. You can also join us on Patreon to fund future body exploration trips. But the best thing you can do for us is leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform and share us with your friends. And we'll see you next time.
This is True Crime XS.
I was moving up the alley using a briefcase and some crutches, and a young woman walked down, and about halfway down the block I encountered her and asked her to help me carry the briefcase, which she did. We walked back up the alley. Basically, when we reached the car, what happened was I knocked her unconscious with the crowbar, and I handcuffed her and put her in the passenger side of the car and drove away. One of the things that makes it among the things that makes it difficult is that at this point she was quite lucid, talking about things. It's funny, it's not funny, but it's odd, the kinds of things people say under those circumstances. She had a Spanish test the next day, and she thought that I had taken her to help tutor me for a Spanish test. It's kind of odd. The long and short of it was that I again knocked her unconscious and strangled her. Can you hear that? The Hawkins girl's head was severed and taken up the road about 25 to 50 yards. west of the road on a rocky hillside. By this time, it was almost dawn, but on this particular morning, I was just absolutely, again, just shocked, kind of scared to death, shocked, horrified and I went down the road, throwing the briefcase, the crutches, the rope, the clothes, just tossing them out the window, and the crowbar, everything, handcuffs, everything. I gotta get mad at myself a few weeks later because I'd have to go and buy another pair. I mean, it's not comical, but that's what would happen. This was just, I was in a sheer state of panic, of just absolute horror, you know. It's like, at that point in time, this consciousness of what has really happened is like, you break out of a fever or something. I would, that is. And so I drove, talk about details coming back. I couldn't find one of the shoes, so I thought it was there, but it wasn't. So I went back. This was the next day. Got on my bicycle, rode back to that little parking lot. I knew there were police all over the place by that time. So I went back to that parking lot and I found both the pierced earrings and the shoe laying in the parking lot. So I surreptitiously gathered them up and rode off. So, there you are.
Making my way back home. It's been so long. It's been so many years. So many tears. So long. Gambled away my